A soddy kitchen somewhere between Kansas and Nebraska, October of 1934. A woman named Opal Rasmussen stands over a table with a fresh butchered haunch of beef in front of her. No icebox anywhere on the place, no electric line within 8 miles of her door. Just a knife, a stretch of clean cloth, and the kind of knowledge that had already fed 3 generations of her own family without a single case of spoiled meat to show for it. By the time she's done with that haunch, 3 days from now, not 1 pound of it will have gone to waste, and not 1 pound of it will need a single degree of refrigeration to keep clean through the winter ahead. Some of it hangs in strips off the eave of the roof, in a wind that never stops blowing across this stretch of country. Some of it simmers slow in its own rendered fat on the back of the stove, headed for a stoneware crock in the cellar. The rest waits, wrapped in cloth and hung from a rafter in the lean-to, for the first hard freeze to do a job no icebox on earth could do better or cheaper. Here's the thing worth knowing, friend. Before we go one step further, none of what Opal did that week was a workaround, some lesser substitute for the real thing sitting in some other, better-equipped kitchen with electricity running to it. It was the actual technology, tested and refined over generations of trial and hard-won error, for keeping meat genuinely safe to eat without a single watt of electricity ever touching it. I'm Amos Whitfield, 5th generation on Whitfield land between Kansas and Nebraska, tending the same stretch of ground my own people broke more than a century back. My grandfather Homer wrote a good deal of what follows into a leather journal he kept from 1934 until the year he died. Methods he learned from his own mother standing at that same kitchen table, and he swore he'd pass it all along before it went the way of the icebox salesman's memory, forgotten the moment something shinier came along to replace it. If you're new here, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we spend our time exactly here pulling this kind of hard-earned, no-electricity knowledge back into daylight before the last person who actually did it by hand is gone for good. There are 5 pieces to doing this right, friend. 4 of them your own great-grandmother could walk you through over a cup of coffee on a slow afternoon. The 5th is the one that decides whether the whole effort keeps a family fed all winter or does something considerably worse, and I'm not skipping past it to get to the easy parts, no matter how tempting that would be. Let's start with the piece most people get wrong before they've even picked up a knife. Piece 1. Choosing the cut. Not every piece of a butchered animal wants the same treatment, and a prairie family learned this fast. The first winter they tried it themselves, or they learned it the hard way with a spoiled batch and a hard lesson attached to it. Lean cuts, the round, the flank, the tougher working muscles off the hind leg that had spent a lifetime doing actual work on the animal, took to drying beautifully because there was little fat marbled through them to turn rancid sitting in open air over the drying weeks ahead. Fattier cuts, the shoulder, the brisket, anything marbled through with rich, generous tissue that would have made a poor candidate for the drying rack, went a different direction entirely, rendered down slow into fat-sealed potted meat instead, because that same fat that would spoil a strip of jerky inside a week was exactly what a potting crock needed to seal a batch airtight for months at a stretch. And the choicest whole cuts, a good roast, or a full set of ribs worth saving whole rather than cutting down, got saved for the 3rd method on this list. One that needed no rendering and no drying at all, just a calendar and a genuine cold snap to do all the work for free. Homer's journal is blunt about the mistake beginners made most often. The same mistake he watched his own younger cousin make one bad autumn on a neighboring section. Try to dry a fatty cut, and you'll have rancid jerky inside 2 weeks, no matter how good your technique otherwise was, no matter how carefully you sliced it, or how steady the wind happened to blow that particular week. The fat itself was the failure point, not the method. And no amount of skill in the drying itself could ever make up for starting with the wrong piece of the animal in the first place. First pattern. Break, friend. The next piece is the one most people picture first. Straight away. The moment they think about meat kept without a refrigerator anywhere on the property, and it's also the piece the modern food safety folks have the most to say about, so stay with me through the honest parts as well as the flattering ones. Piece 2. Sun and wind, drying. A lean cut sliced thin, 1/4 inch or less, always against the grain so the finished jerky wouldn't shred to bits the first time you bit into it. hung on a rack built from scrap lumber or strung on plain twine in a spot that caught steady prairie wind and full sun both at once. Lost most of its moisture inside 2 or 3 days on a good dry stretch of weather, this particular stretch of country being about as good a natural drying climate as exists anywhere on the entire continent, drier by far than most places that ever tried the same trick. Some families rubbed the strips with salt first, or hung them over a low, smoky fire for an hour before setting them out proper in the open air, both of which helped keep flies off the meat and added a bit of extra protection on top of what the wind and sun were already doing all on their own. Flies were the real enemy in the first day or two, before the surface had dried enough to stop being attractive to them. And a family without screening of any kind learned to hang the rack somewhere the wind stayed steady enough to discourage a fly from landing at all. The physics underneath all of it is simple enough that Homer's own mother could have explained it to a child without ever once using the word bacteria. Nothing that causes spoilage. Not mold. Not bacteria. Not the natural enzymes already present in the meat itself that slowly break tissue down over time, can do its work without water available to work in. Pull the water out fast enough, before any of those processes get a real foothold, and you've pulled the rug out from under every single one of them at once, stopped cold, before they ever got started. A pound of fresh meat came off that rack, weighing something close to 4 ounces, light enough to carry in a saddlebag for a week without a second thought, and dense enough in calories that a man could work a full day off a handful of it and a canteen of water. The word itself, jerky, traces back to charqui, a word Spanish settlers borrowed from the Quechua peoples of South America centuries before it ever reached a Kansas kitchen. And the technique underneath it is older still, older than any single language spoken on this continent. Native peoples across the plains had already refined a version of this same trick long before a single sod house went up anywhere in this country, pounding their own dried meat together with rendered fat and dried berries into pemmican, a preserved food dense enough and stable enough to carry a hunting party through an entire winter, and plenty of the earliest homesteading families out here learned the core of this method directly from that older knowledge rather than inventing it fresh themselves. Now, I want to be straight with you here, because this whole channel only works if I tell you the whole truth and not just the flattering half of it. The modern USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, looking at exactly this method with modern instruments and decades of laboratory research behind them, does not recommend plain sun-drying the way Opal Rasmussen and 100,000 families like her did it across this country. Their concern isn't that the drying itself fails to work. It's that meat left raw through the early hours of a slow, inconsistent dry can let surface bacteria multiply faster than the moisture actually leaves the tissue. And once that meat is fully dried, those same bacteria become considerably more heat-resistant than they were to start with, harder to kill later, even if you did eventually decide to cook the finished jerky through before eating it. Today's guidance says to heat meat to a full 160 degrees, checked with an actual thermometer, before it ever goes anywhere near the drying rack, precisely to close that particular window before it can open. Prairie families in the 30s didn't have a food thermometer sitting on the counter, and they certainly didn't have that specific research sitting in front of them at the kitchen table. What they had instead was genuinely exceptional drying conditions, arguably the driest stretch of farmable country in America. Humidity low enough and wind steady enough day after day that a properly sliced, properly thin cut lost its danger zone considerably faster than most other parts of the country could ever manage, even trying their level best. That's not an excuse to skip the modern step if you're trying this yourself today, friend, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I told you otherwise. It's an honest explanation of why a method without that extra step worked, as well as it did for as long as it did out here specifically, generation after generation. And why that same exact method tried in a humid Georgia summer or a damp coastal county got families sick a good deal more often than it ever did on this particular stretch of dry, windswept ground. Piece 3. Potting under rendered fat. This one starts the same way Piece 1 does, at the table with a knife. But it ends up somewhere completely different by the time it's done. A fattier cut got cubed small, salted heavy, well beyond what you'd salt a dish meant for eating that same night, and cooked low and slow for the better part of a full day, sometimes simmering right in its own rendered fat the whole time, until the meat had gone tender enough to pull apart with the back of a spoon and separate from the bone without any real effort. Packed into a clean stoneware crock while still warm, pressed down tight with the back of that same spoon to push out every last pocket of trapped air, working its way through the meat. The whole batch got topped with a final layer of clean rendered fat poured carefully over the surface. At least a 1/4 inch deep and often closer to a full inch thick if the family meant to keep the batch any real length of time through the winter. That fat seal, once it cooled solid overnight, kept air away from the meat underneath entirely, sealing it off the way a lid never quite manages on its own. And it was air, more than almost anything else, that spoiled meat trying to sit at room temperature for any real stretch of time. Set in the coolest corner of a cellar or a dugout, ideally somewhere that never rose much above the temperature of a modern refrigerator even in the warmer months, a properly potted batch could hold for weeks at a stretch, longer still in genuinely cold weather. A family working down through the crock, a spoonful at a time, spread on toast, or stirred straight into a pot of beans simmering on the stove. This particular method traveled a long way to reach a Kansas kitchen table. English and French settlers had been potting meat under fat for generations before a single one of them ever crossed the Atlantic. And the technique simply carried west along with everything else a family packed into a wagon, adapted to whatever animal and whatever fat a prairie homestead actually had on hand that season. Second pattern break, friend. Piece 4 is the simplest of the whole list by a wide margin, and it's also the piece that depended least on skill and most on a family reading its own calendar correctly, season after season, without fail. Piece 4. Natural winter freezing. This is the method that needed no rendering, no drying rack, and no crock at all, just patience and a genuine hard freeze to do the work for you. Prairie families time their butchering to the first real cold snap of the season on purpose, waiting for a forecast, or more often just the feel of a particular kind of sky. That promised a stretch of days staying reliably below freezing, clear through both day and night, then hung whole cuts, wrapped snug in clean cloth to keep dust and insects off the surface, in an unheated shed, a dugout, or a north-facing lean-to specifically chosen, because the sun never quite reached the meat directly, even at midday. Once frozen solid clear through, that meat stayed exactly as safe as anything sitting in a modern chest freezer today, for the simple, honest reason that it was working off the identical physics a modern freezer runs on, just without the compressor humming away and without a single dollar of electric bill attached to any of it. A family could keep meat this way clear through to a late thaw in March some years, cutting off exactly what was needed for a given meal a piece at a time with a handsaw and leaving the rest frozen solid, untouched, until the next meal called for it days or weeks later. The one real skill in this piece wasn't technical at all, and it required no special equipment whatsoever, no tools beyond a handsaw and a length of good cloth. It was patience, and a willingness to read the sky closely enough to tell a true hard freeze apart from a passing cold snap that would thaw back out again in 3 days and ruin the whole batch before a family even realized what had happened to it. Piece 5. The piece that decides everything. Here's where I need you to lean in close, friend, because this is the piece that separates a family that ate safely all winter from a family that got very, very sick. And it applies most directly to piece 3, the potting method. Though the underlying lesson is worth understanding no matter which of these 3 methods you're actually using. A fat seal over a crock of meat does something specific and genuinely dangerous if it isn't done exactly right, and it's worth slowing down here rather than rushing past it. It creates a low oxygen environment, sealed tight away from the air above it, sitting at whatever temperature the room happens to be that particular week. That is precisely the environment an organism called Clostridium botulinum thrives in. And I want to say this plainly because it matters more than almost anything else in this entire video. Botulism does not announce itself with a bad smell or an off color the way ordinary spoilage usually does, the kind of warning sign that would send anybody straight to the hog trough with a spoiled batch. A crock can look, smell, and taste completely normal, right up until the moment it isn't. And the toxin it produces is genuinely one of the most dangerous substances known in the natural world, deadly to a grown adult in an amount too small to see with the naked eye. Worse still, and this is the part that surprises most people the first time they hear it, the spores that cause it can survive a full rolling boil at the stove. So cooking the meat thoroughly before potting it, which every single family did as a matter of ordinary course, does not by itself guarantee safety against this one particular danger sitting underneath everything else. What actually protected a family potting meat back in 1934 was never any single step working alone. It was several separate barriers stacked together at once, each one covering a gap the others didn't. Heavy salt first, well beyond what you'd use for flavor alone, because botulism does not tolerate a high-salt environment well and struggles to establish itself in meat cured properly. Genuinely cold storage second, well under the 50-degree mark and colder whenever a family could manage it, often colder than that in a proper dugout cellar, since the organism does its dangerous work far more slowly in cold conditions than it does anywhere near room temperature. And short consumption windows third, a crock meant to be worked down within a couple of weeks of opening, never treated as a pantry item, meant to sit untouched on a shelf for months, the way a properly sealed modern can might safely be. Homer's journal is more direct about this particular piece than about almost anything else he wrote down in that whole book. He noted plainly that potting was done specifically in the coldest stretch of the year, never once attempted in a warm month no matter how convenient the timing might otherwise have been, and that a crock sitting too long without being worked down steadily was pitched straight to the hogs rather than risked on the family table. No exceptions made for a lean week. Modern guidance from food safety researchers backs up exactly this same instinct today, arriving at it from the opposite direction with laboratory confirmation instead of hard-won family experience, confirming that salt, genuine cold, and a short shelf life remain, to this day, the real safeguards against this particular danger. Not the fat seal by itself, and not the cooking step by itself either. If you try this yourself today, friend, treat it with precisely the same respect Homer's generation gave it. Keep it cold. Keep the salt genuinely heavy. And don't ever let a crock sit untouched for months, just because it happens to look perfectly fine sitting there on the shelf. I'll tell you honestly, I potted a batch myself 2 winters back, mostly out of curiosity about whether I could still do it the way Homer described it in that journal without cutting a single corner. I kept a cheap thermometer stuck in the cellar the whole time, just to satisfy myself the temperature was actually holding where it needed to. And I marked the date on the crock the same way Opal supposedly did, same way Homer always did on our own place. It held clean for the better part of 6 weeks before we worked our way down to the bottom of it, and I'll admit there was a strange kind of pride in eating something my own hands had made safe without a single appliance helping me do it. That said, I checked that thermometer more than I probably needed to. Some habits are worth keeping even after you trust the method. Opal Rasmussen's haunch of beef, 3 days after she started on it, ended up split 3 ways exactly the way I described it at the top of this video. Strips of it dried hard and light in the wind off the roofline, curling slightly at the edges the way a properly dried strip always does. A portion of it simmered down slow and sealed under a full inch of fat in a crock set in the coolest corner of her cellar, marked in her own hand with the date so nobody else in the house would forget how long it had actually been sitting since it went in. And the best cuts hung wrapped in clean cloth in a lean-to shed, waiting patiently on a hard freeze that arrived, according to Homer's own journal entry from that same county that same week, 4 days later, right on schedule with what the sky had been promising. Not 1 pound of that animal went to waste across the whole 3 days of work, and not one soul in that house got sick off any of it that entire winter because Opal knew something a good deal more valuable than any single recipe written down in a book. She knew exactly which danger each method was actually protecting against: moisture, air, or temperature. And she never once assumed that one precaution, however careful, covered a threat it was never actually built to cover in the first place. Comment down below and tell me if your own family preserved meat this way, drying, potting, or waiting patiently on that first hard freeze, and which method got passed down furthest through your own family's memory before it finally stopped getting used. I read every single comment, and the method that shows up most often is the one I go deeper on in the next video. If you take one thing out of this video and actually use it yourself, let it be this. Every one of these 3 methods works by defeating a different threat in a genuinely different way. Moisture for the dried meat, oxygen for the potted meat, temperature for the frozen meat sitting in the shed, and the 5th piece, the safety piece, only holds up if you understand which threat you're actually up against instead of simply assuming any one precaution covers all of them at once just because it worked once before. That's not just true of meat sitting in a crock, friend. It's true of most things worth doing right in this life, whether you're standing on a farm or nowhere near one. And it's the kind of thinking that separates a family that gets lucky from a family that genuinely knows what it's doing. Next time on this channel, I'll walk you through the 2-cent trick that kept a whole county's seed corn alive through a drought the extension office swore could not be beaten, and the exact year the hybrid seed companies made sure nobody would ever need to remember it again. I'm Amos Whitfield, and thank you kindly for listening.